Welcome. Um, on behalf of student-run clubs and organizations here at UAGC, I would like to thank you for participating in our Suicide Prevention Month activities and our speaker events. My name is Kat, and I live in Nashville with my husband, our two teenagers, and our guinea pigs. Um, I hold both a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology with a concentration in forensics. And I am currently enrolled here at UAGC, where I'm working toward earning my Doctor of Psychology, specializing in criminology and justice studies. I'm the current president of UAGC's Women in STEM Club, and I'm doing this presentation on behalf of Women in STEM. It's an honor to be here tonight to chat with you all about LGBTQ plus suicide prevention. As the mother of an LGBTQ plus kid who struggles with mental health issues and frequent suicidal ideation, this topic is very close to my heart. And unfortunately, members of the LGBTQ plus community often don't receive adequate support or mental health care services. And this is especially true for the youth in the LGBTQ plus community. So before we begin, some of the content discussed in this presentation may be triggering or uncomfortable for some folks, and that's totally okay. Suicide is not a pretty topic, especially when you have experienced its impact personally or with a loved one. So if at any time you feel distressed, please feel free to step away and come back later if you can. The presentation is being recorded and it will be available to watch later as well. So suicide is the 12th leading cause of death annually in the United States. Each year, more than 1 million people of all ages will attempt to end their own lives. In 2020, there were an estimated 12.2 million adult Americans who seriously considered ending their lives. 3.2 million adult Americans actively planned a suicide attempt, and 1.2 million adult Americans went through with attempting suicide. Also in 2020, 45,979 deaths were attributable to suicide in the United States. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that annually there are about 800,000 people who end their own lives. So there is no single demographic that is exclusively vulnerable to suicide. However, populations such as adults over the age of 45, military personnel, sexual and gender minorities, individuals with substance abuse disorders, victims of abuse and violence, those who have recently lost a job or who have had a marriage end, these people would all be considered as being at a significantly increased risk of attempting or completing suicide. Attempted suicide rates and suicidal ideation among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals are significantly higher than they would be among like the general population. And this is especially true for LGBTQ plus youth. So LGBTQ plus youth are not inherently prone to suicide risk because they're LGBTQ plus, but rather it's because of the way they're mistreated and stigmatized by society. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people between the ages of 10 and 24, and LGBTQ plus youth are at a significantly increased risk compared to heterosexual and cisgender peers from the same age group. LGBTQ plus youth are about more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. So more than 1.8 million LGBTQ plus youth between the ages of 13 and 24 will seriously consider ending their lives each year in the United States, and at least one will attempt suicide about every 45 seconds. Intersectionality is the framework we use for determining how interdependent and multidimensional social identities like race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality are influenced by systems of privilege and oppression. And, those occur at a societal level, such as things like heterosexism, cisgenderism, and even like racism. So, an intersection of identities can create unique and distinct stressors for LGBTQ plus youth when compared to their peers. And minority stressors are especially persistent and problematic, really for youth who might find themselves occupying multiple marginalized social positions. So this often contributes to research that's performed to not be able to account for within group differences that exist among LGBTQ plus youth. So that really kind of limits our understanding of how within group disparities would influence suicidal thoughts and behaviors. However, we do know that bisexual, transgender, non-binary, and other youth of color who are part of the LGBTQ plus community face these increased disparities when compared to, again, those peer groups that are heterosexual or cisgender. So bisexual individuals report significantly higher rates of depression, bullying, sexual assault, and physical harm. And about 48% of bisexual youth have considered suicide in the past year, and about 27% of those actually attempted suicide. And then when you look at gay and lesbian youth, we have about 37% of those who have seriously considered suicide in the past year, with about 19% of those actually attempting suicide. So it's really that when you compare that to the next statistic, it kind of really brings it all into perspective, because among heterosexual and cisgender youth, only about 14% of that entire population considered suicide in the past year, and only about 6% actually attempted suicide. And that's not to negate that there are people from that population with very real mental health issues, but it does kind of bring into focus that disparity that exists. Um, Transgender and non-binary individuals, they face an even more elevated risk for depression and suicide compared to heterosexual and cisgender peers, including other members of the LGBTQ plus community who identify as cisgender. So those who identify as transgender or non-binary, they're about 2 to 2.5 times more likely to seriously consider or attempt suicide than their cisgender LGBTQ peers. And then we look at LGBTQ plus youth of color who have reported significantly higher rates of suicide attempts over the past year than their white peers. Um, Only about 12% of white youth attempted suicide in the past year, and that's compared to 21% of Native Indigenous youth, 20% of Middle Eastern and Northern African youth, 19% of Black youth, 17% of multiracial youth, 16% of Latinx youth, and right around 12% of Asian and Pacific Islander youth. So Black, transgender, and non-binary youth report significantly disproportionate rates of suicide risk, with about 59% of that population seriously considering suicide, and more than 1 in 4 actually attempting suicide within the last year. So these disparities bring the impacts of historical and ongoing oppression and the trauma that is inflicted on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I mean, really to the forefront. And it highlights something that a lot of people may not really be aware of. And furthermore, suicide risk and mental health disparities remain constant across gender identity and race and ethnicity. So LGBTQ plus individuals who experience minority stressors are automatically at 12 times greater risk of attempting suicide than those who have not experienced any minority stressors. Suicide prevention and awareness are important because this is a public health issue, and it's a public health issue that causes long-term negative consequences to individuals, families, and communities. And overall, the goal of suicide prevention is to reduce risk factors and increase protective factors that promote and encourage resilience while also empowering those at risk to reach out for help when they need it. Understanding these risk factors, knowing the warning signs, and having information about prevention and intervention are the tools that equip individuals to save lives. Some of the major risk factors that increase the likelihood of suicidal ideation and behaviors are prior suicide attempts, substance abuse, access to lethal means, a familial history of suicide or suicide attempts, social isolation, and even chronic diseases and disabilities. So, other risk factors that can place an individual at an increased risk of suicide are low self esteem, negative values, attitudes, and beliefs, poverty, parent criminality, homelessness, living in communities or neighborhoods that have higher crime rates, and exhibiting patterns of antisocial behaviors. And these risk factors can be exacerbated and even further increase the suicide risk when the individual is like facing legal problems or criminal charges or a loss of employment. If they frequently exhibit aggressive behaviors, if they have poor impulse control, a history of adverse childhood experiences, or even if they have been the victim of things like discrimination, harassment, or bullying. So, and then on the flip side of the risk factors, you have protective factors. So, some of your major protective factors that reduce the likelihood of suicide are access to effective and appropriate mental health care services, having the ability to adapt to changes in personal life and environment, having strong attachments to your family, your community, social institutions that you're involved in, and having a toolbox of healthy coping skills that you can use when you find yourself in crisis. And so, individuals with a strong social support system, strong cultural identity, and the ability to regulate their emotions healthfully are at a significantly reduced risk of attempting suicide. And furthermore, individuals who feel that they have a reason to live, or those who consider themselves to be spiritual, are also more likely to avoid engaging in suicidal behaviors. So, how to know if someone is suicidal? Every time I do a presentation about suicide, it's one of the questions I always get asked. And it's not really an easy one, but there are warning signs that you can look for that can help you determine if someone might be suicidal. So people who are having suicidal ideation, considering suicide, they often experience really intense feelings of emptiness, hopelessness, being trapped, or just having no reason to live. Um, they typically report feeling increased anxiety, agitation, and rage, along with actual physical and emotional pain. So if someone is suicidal, you might also notice changes in their behavior, uh, stuff like planning or researching different ways that you can die, um, withdrawing from family and friends, it's the social isolation, um, saying goodbyes, even if it's in a kind of roundabout way. They may give away items that are important to them or that hold meaning to them. Sometimes they'll make a will. They'll often engage in risky behaviors. They'll display extreme mood swings. They may begin eating and sleeping more or less than what is normal for them. And they're more likely to begin abusing drugs and alcohol. And the other question that always comes up is, how do I help someone who is suicidal? So if you or a person you know are suicidal, there are appropriate strategies for intervention that should be considered. So when you're attempting to provide help to someone who is suicidal, you should always begin by building a solid rapport. Um, that opens the line of communication. Um, you should always make sure to encourage adherence to any existing safety or treatment plans that are in place because you never want to disrupt those. You want to make sure that they're being provided access to resources during their time of crisis. That could look like seeing a therapist, considering inpatient treatment, reaching out to like um, crisis services, any anything that gives them extra support. You want to make sure that you're validating their feelings, and you really want to avoid the use of any language that could come across as accusatory or judgmental or condescending. And then you want to determine whether the person is an imminent risk or not. So if they are an imminent risk, that would mean that they are thinking about killing themselves. They have access to lethal means. They have a time frame selected within the next 48 hours. And if they meet that criteria, then they should be urged to consider seeking inpatient psychiatric treatment or be placed under an involuntary hold at a psychiatric facility. For medium and high risk people who don't necessarily meet the criteria for being declared at imminent risk, they should be assisted in creating a safety plan that includes coping strategies and offered support that can help decrease the risk of their likelihood of engaging in suicidal behavior. And then, of course, if it's an emergency and the person is in the process of actively trying to end their life, call 911 for emergency services. That's so there are ways that you can work to explore alternatives to suicide. So because we often have not experienced the same situations and feelings as another person who's experiencing suicidal ideation, it's typically unhelpful to offer advice or to go heavy into problem solving mode or to tell them what they should do next. Instead, you really want to focus on a collaborative approach, and that should be focused on exploring the ways they have coped in the past, things they have considered doing to cope now or in the future, and activities they can engage in as a distraction, and then a discussion about how they feel about the options available to them. So also beneficial is to utilize a harm reduction approach when you're assisting individuals who are suicidal. Um, because suicidal ideation can really come from this huge range of circumstances, and it really varies in the degree of risk of potential harm. So the individual's perspective and agency should really always be centered. Um, and you should trust that they know their situation best and they are probably better positioned to make decisions for their life than anyone else is, even if they're currently in crisis. So when you use a harm reduction framework, it allows whoever is helping the suicidal person to really explore the options that are associated with situations and behaviors that involve a risk of harm, and then work collaboratively to find ways that can make them safer in non-judgmental and non-prescriptive ways. So I've mentioned safety planning several times throughout this. So safety planning is a crucial tool in empowering suicidal people to develop a plan consisting of specific strategies that they can use to stay safe. Safety plans are really beneficial in any situation where an individual is in danger of harming themselves, harming others, or being harmed by another person. Um, Safety plans are detailed, specific, organized, actionable, and collaboratively developed. These plans can contain steps to help individuals maintain their safety on their own or until help arrives. Um, these plans usually consist of identifying potential triggers that cause distress, identifying healthy coping skills, identifying support systems, separating themselves from lethal means or means for self harm, and exploring professional resources that might be available to the individual. So, safety plans allow the suicidal person to prioritize their agency in determining the strategies that will be most helpful to them when they're in a state of crisis. And ideally, these safety plans can actually work to mitigate future crises that might arise for the person by allowing them to kind of consider strategies for de-escalation while they're not in a state of crisis. And that can also reduce the likelihood of potentially needing to involve third parties without the consent of the suicidal person. So that means like having to call emergency services if there's an appropriate safety plan in place. Sometimes that can be avoided. Um, so when you're working with a suicidal person to create a safety plan, you should always work collaboratively to develop the plan. You want to make sure that plan is tailored specifically to that person's needs. It's really important to make sure that you're utilizing a no harm or harm reduction approach. You want to explore social and professional supports, identify sources of support that are available 24/7. If they can't get a hold of anybody else, they can get a hold of them. And that can be places like Crisis Text Line or the Trevor Project. And you should really encourage the person to document their safety plan in writing so it feels more concrete and they have a physical copy of it that they can go back and look at in, you know, future times of crisis. And I mean, a solid and effective safety plan, one that is going to work, it has to be specific, thorough, actionable, achievable, and it has to involve the explicit consent of the suicidal person. Um, Sometimes, and this is rare, but it does happen. And when this happens, you should always consult a professional before encouraging it. But sometimes suicidal people may identify self-harm as part of their safety plan. Um, and they really rationalize it. They rationalize it by talking about like how self-harm can reduce their thoughts of suicide. They say that it can help cope with stressors and conditions related to stressors like anger. Um, they say that it can fulfill a need for sensation or distraction. It can alleviate guilt and feelings of numbness, sadness, loneliness, fear, restlessness. So when a suicidal person expresses that self-harm helps alleviate their feelings of wanting to die, we should validate those feelings and utilize a harm reduction approach to self-harming if this is included in a safety plan. And by um, harm reduction approaches to self-harming, that could be like, so instead of cutting, you're gonna snap a rubber band against your wrist. Or there was one that went around, I know a few years ago, it was the Butterfly Project, and it was wherever you wanted to harm yourself on your body, instead of doing that, you would draw a butterfly on that area. I mean, it can be any way that you can still get that feeling of it being the outlet while doing it in a safer way that causes less harm. So there are suicide prevention resources available. There are many, many. There are more now than there were pre-COVID. These are three of the most popular, and they're three of the most easily accessible. So 988, that is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The 988 Suicide Crisis Lifeline, it is a United States-based suicide prevention network. It consists of like 200 crisis centers, and they provide 24/7 services via a toll-free hotline. It's available to anyone who is in suicidal crisis or emotional distress. And you can also reach them by visiting their website. It's 988lifeline.org. Crisis Text Line is a global not-for-profit organization. They provide free mental health texting services through confidential crisis intervention, and they do that via SMS message. Their services are available 24/7 and throughout the United States, Canada, the UK, and Ireland. You can connect with Crisis Text Line by texting home to 741-741. And then the Trevor Project offers remote crisis counseling for LGBTQ plus youth in the United States who are 25 years old or younger. Services are available 24/7, and they can be accessed via phone, chat, or text. The services are 100% confidential and 100% free. So to access services via text, you would text the word START to 678-678. To access services by phone, you would call 1-866-488-7386. And to access via computer, you would visit thetrevorproject.org/get-help. So if you're interested in volunteering to help suicidal individuals who are in crisis, the aforementioned services are always in need of volunteers, or you can Google organizations local to you who may have volunteer opportunities available. I have volunteered for Crisis Text Line in the past. I was with them for a couple of years, and then after everything with my kid, I decided that the Trevor Project was really where I needed to be, and I kind of felt called to go there. And I just finished actually my 40 hours of training with them yesterday. So I'm now officially a volunteer for the Trevor Project. If you want to get involved and you're able, the opportunities are out there. Google can lead you to a lot of them. And I mean, it, I know how it sounds, and it sounds cheesy, but volunteers make all the difference for people who are in crisis. And I mean, with the help of volunteers, we can spread awareness about suicide and mental health. We can really break down stigmas and we can save lives. So if you can volunteer, I definitely recommend it. It's very rewarding and it feels good when somebody comes to you and they're really in a place of crisis and they tell you that they want to die and you're able to bring them more to a cool calm. It's a very cool thing. Okay, so thank you so much for allowing me to take up some of your time this evening. It has been a pleasure chatting with you all, and I hope that I was able to provide at least some valuable information for you to take away from this conversation. If you have any questions that don't get answered tonight, feel free to send me an email at cat.robinson084@outlook.com. For more information about everything that was discussed in the presentation, there is um, a references section at the end of the presentation, and it includes citations for all of the resources that I use to gather the information. So thank you again. Be safe and have a great night.